The knock on the door came just as the rain started to fall. I opened it to find Brandon standing there, his uniform darkened by the drizzle. The same boy I'd kissed goodbye 2 years ago at the base, but he wasn't a boy anymore. He looked older, not just in the angles of his face or the muscle that filled out his frame. It was in his eyes. They carried a weight, a stillness, that hadn't been there before. He dropped his duffel by the door, looked at me for a moment, and then stepped forward, wrapping his arms around me. It was tight, protective, unhurried. "Hi, Mom," he whispered into my hair. I hadn't planned on crying, but the tears came anyway. Everything I had tried so hard to hold in, the loneliness, the betrayal, the quiet collapse of my marriage, rose up in my chest and spilled over. I pulled away, brushing at my face. "Sorry," I said, laughing a little too sharply. "Not exactly the welcome home you expected, huh?" Brandon gave me a small smile and shook his head. "It's exactly what I expected." It wasn't until later that night, when the house had gone quiet and we were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, that I told him. I couldn't keep it hidden any longer. "Your father," I began, but the words felt like glass in my throat. We're not together anymore." Brandon's brows knit together. "When?" "Almost a year ago. I didn't want to tell you while you were deployed." I exhaled slowly. He cheated. It wasn't just once. I think it had been going on for a long time. I just didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to. Brandon didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at me, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "You should have told me." "I didn't want to distract you," I said, tears slipping down my cheek again. "I thought I could handle it on my own." He stood and walked around the table. I expected him to crouch beside me, maybe take my hand. But he didn't. He knelt fully, like a man before something sacred, and wrapped his arms around me. "You don't ever have to handle it alone again," he said. From that moment on, everything shifted. Brandon became a different kind of presence in the house. Protective in a way that felt deeper than duty. He fixed things that had sat broken for months. He started cooking dinner, walking me to the car if I left after dark, brushing hair from my face when I looked tired. There was a quiet attentiveness in him now, a steadiness. He didn't ask permission. He simply acted, like he had sworn to himself that I would never feel abandoned again. One night, I found myself watching him from the hallway, standing in the soft glow of the kitchen light as he poured us each a glass of wine. He looked peaceful, focused. He handed me the glass with a slight grin. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. I hesitated, meeting his eyes. "To peace." But I felt anything but peaceful, because something in the way he looked at me was beginning to scare me, in the gentlest, most impossible way. His gaze lingered. Not hungry, not inappropriate, but reverent. And the way I responded to it, it made my heart race in a way it hadn't in years. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the rain tapping against the window, thinking about the man sleeping down the hall. Not my ex-husband. My son. My boy. Except he wasn't a boy anymore. He had come home taller, broader, quieter. And everything he did now, every thoughtful glance, every hand placed gently at the small of my back when we passed in the hallway, whispered something I didn't know how to name. The next morning, I found him in the garden, kneeling beside the half-dead azaleas that I had given up on months ago. "They just needed water," he said, looking up at me. I didn't respond. He stood and walked toward me, hands dirty, eyes searching mine. "You look tired." "I'm fine." "You always say that," he said gently, brushing a leaf from my shoulder. "But I see you." My throat tightened. "You're not supposed to be the one who—" "Why not?" he interrupted softly. "Why can't I take care of you for once?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know anymore. He had become something else to me, someone who knew the version of me before I was broken, someone who had come back to find me still holding the pieces. And somewhere, deep inside, something dangerous was beginning to bloom. Not in a way I could speak aloud, but in the quiet, in the spaces between words, I felt it. And I wasn't sure I could make it stop. Something about the way Brandon looked at me had changed. It was subtle at first. A longer glance across the kitchen table, the way his eyes softened when I walked into the room, the way he stood just a little closer than necessary when handing me a plate. At first, I chalked it up to protectiveness. After all, he'd returned from the army not as the boy I raised, but a man calm, steady, older in every sense. A soldier who had seen too much and somehow still looked at me like I mattered. But then there were the moments that made me pause. Like the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd catch his eyes tracing the edge of my shoulder, lingering on my face for a heartbeat too long. There was a kind of reverence in his gaze, one I hadn't seen in years. Not from his father, not from anyone. And I started to feel it too. Something shifted inside me, like the turning of a season. I'd catch myself smoothing my hair before coming into the room where he was, or changing into a softer blouse in the evening instead of the usual sweatshirt. I told myself it was nothing. That I was just tired of hiding in frayed clothes and silence. But the truth was, I felt seen again. Brandon didn't just help around the house, he noticed things. The way I liked my tea. The way I tucked my legs under me on the couch when it was cold. The small sigh I gave when I thought no one was listening. He was always there, in that quiet way of his, just present. Solid. One night I came out of the bathroom wrapped in my robe, toweling my damp hair, and nearly bumped into him in the hallway. I hadn't realized he was standing there, about to head to the kitchen. I stopped. So did he. There was nothing inappropriate in his eyes, only warmth, only attention. But something in me fluttered, like I'd forgotten how it felt to be noticed. He gave a little nod and stepped aside. Didn't mean to surprise you, he murmured. You didn't, I replied, though the heat in my chest told another story. From then on, it became harder to pretend I didn't feel what was stirring beneath the surface. We still didn't speak of it, not with words. But the tension in the air, the lingering touches, the way he'd brush a strand of hair from my cheek like it was instinct, it was all there, wrapped in silence. I told myself it was the closeness of a bond that had deepened since his return. That I was just clinging to him in the wake of everything I had lost. But it wasn't just grief. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly it was I had begun to feel when I looked at my son. Not as a child. Not as the baby I once rocked to sleep. But as a man. A good man. And that was what scared me most. One afternoon, we were sipping coffee in the living room when I turned to him and said, "You know what I'd really like to do for my birthday?" Brandon looked up, setting his cup down. "Tell me." "Take the trailer up to the lake. Just us." His face lit up in that quiet, sincere way of his. "Like we used to?" I nodded, trying not to let the rush of feeling show on my face. "Exactly like that." He agreed immediately, and within the week we were packed and on the road. The drive felt like stepping into another life. Music on low, windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of pine and late spring. The further we got from the city, the more I felt myself letting go of the pain, the disappointment, the loneliness that had nested itself inside me after the divorce. By the time we pulled up to Crescent Lake, the light was stretching golden across the water, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. That night we sat under a blanket of stars, a campfire crackling between us. Brandon passed me a glass of wine, and I watched the way the flame flickered in his eyes. He looked different out here, more open, less guarded. We talked, really talked, about the divorce, about what it had done to me, about how small I had felt, how betrayed. I told him things I hadn't said aloud to anyone, not even myself. I don't know why I trusted him with it all. Maybe because he didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix it or give me empty words. He just listened. And when it was his turn, he told me about the army. About the silence, the loneliness, the losses. He told me about the nights he couldn't sleep and the moments he didn't know if he'd come home at all. We held hands then, fingers curling together in the darkness. And it didn't feel wrong. It felt right. Like we were the only two people left in the world, and for once, that was enough. "It feels like nothing else matters here," I whispered. "Like the world can't reach us." Brandon's thumb brushed along the edge of my hand. "Because it can't," he said. "Not here. Not now." I turned to look at him, and he met my gaze with such quiet intensity it made my breath hitch. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me. He didn't. But something passed between us all the same, unspoken, but undeniable. We sat there long after the fire had gone down, wrapped in silence that didn't feel empty. In that trailer, beside that lake, with my son beside me, I felt something I hadn't in years. Whole. Wanted. And perhaps, loved in a way I couldn't yet understand. We spent the next morning by the lake, barefoot in the grass, the mist curling off the water like breath. Brandon made coffee over the fire pit, and I watched him from the steps of the trailer, arms wrapped around my knees. He didn't notice I was staring. Or maybe he did, and he was just kind enough not to say anything. There was a new stillness between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was full. Like something had rooted itself there in the quiet, something neither of us dared touch just yet. He handed me the coffee, his fingers brushing mine. That now familiar warmth spread up my arm and nestled somewhere behind my ribs. I smiled, small and soft. "You were always good at making coffee out here," I said. He looked at me, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "You always say that, but I swear it's just the lake. Everything tastes better when it smells like pine and wood smoke." We sat in comfortable silence, sipping, watching the morning unfurl. A pair of birds danced across the water. In the distance, a loon called, long and low. "You look different out here," he said suddenly, without looking at me. My heart skipped. "Different how?" He took a moment. "I don't know. Lighter. Like you're not holding your breath anymore." I turned away, blinking against the sudden burn behind my eyes. "Maybe because I'm not." "You shouldn't have had to for so long," he said quietly. "I hate that you did." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Later that afternoon, we took the rowboat out. The lake was calm, glittering beneath the early spring sun. I hadn't been in that boat for years, but the moment I stepped in, it felt like nothing had changed. Brandon rowed slowly, letting us drift farther from shore, farther from everything that felt heavy. "You remember when we tipped this thing over?" I laughed. He groaned. "Please don't remind me. I thought I'd drown." "You were laughing so hard you couldn't breathe." "I was laughing because you insisted we didn't need life jackets. Said you were army strong." "I was 16, he grinned. "And very wrong." I shook my head, wiping a tear from the corner of my eye. "That was a good day." "They're all good with you," he said, and this time, his voice was different. I looked at him, and the world stopped moving, because there was something in his eyes that wasn't just affection. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't even admiration. It was something deeper, wilder, quieter, like a secret he hadn't meant to speak aloud. He looked away, back toward the horizon, but the air between us had shifted again. We didn't say anything more as he rowed us back to shore, but the silence buzzed with unspoken things. Longing, fear, recognition. That night, we sat inside the trailer while the rain came down gently on the roof, soft and steady. We'd lit the lanterns, played a little music, just enough to fill the background. The kind of evening that used to feel ordinary. Safe. But nothing about us felt ordinary anymore. Brandon was reading in the corner of the booth while I sipped wine, my legs curled up beneath me. At one point, he looked up, and our eyes met across the small space. Neither of us looked away. "I've been trying to figure out what this is," he said, his voice low. I knew what he meant, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. "I don't want to hurt you," he added. "Or confuse things." I swallowed hard. "You haven't," I whispered. "You've made me feel safe and seen. Maybe for the first time in a long time." His hand moved across the table, palm up. An invitation. I didn't think. I just set mine in his. His thumb ran along my knuckles slowly, deliberately. I closed my eyes, breathing in the sound of the rain, the warmth of his skin. Nothing about it felt wrong. It felt like the most honest thing I had allowed myself in years. We didn't talk about labels, about what it meant. We just stayed there, his hand holding mine across the space between us, a space that had become sacred. Later, as we lay in our separate beds on either side of the trailer, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. "I never wanted you to have to be the one to carry me," I said into the dark. His voice came back, steady and soft. "Maybe I needed someone to carry too." There was a pause. And then, in the silence that followed, I realized something I hadn't dared admit until that moment. I loved him, not just as my son, not just as my protector, but as the only soul on earth who had seen me, truly seen me, and chosen to stay. We packed up the trailer the next morning beneath a sky washed clean by rain. The trees glistened. The grass was still wet. I moved slowly, folding blankets, storing dishes with more care than usual, like part of me didn't want to leave, like if I lingered long enough, maybe we wouldn't have to return to the world where names and boundaries mattered so much. Brandon was quiet too. He worked with that same quiet determination he always carried, but his eyes kept flicking to me when he thought I wouldn't notice. He knew the weight of what had passed between us in the dark. We didn't speak of it. We didn't need to. It had already spoken for itself in the way we held hands by the fire, in the hush of our voices inside the trailer, in the silence that no longer felt like silence at all. By mid-morning we were on the road again, the trailer swaying gently behind us as we wound back down through the hills. I sat in the passenger seat, hands resting on my lap, eyes half-lidded from the calm exhaustion that comes with too much emotion and too little sleep. Brandon reached for the radio and put on something soft, instrumental, familiar, and for a while we let the sound fill the space. Trees blurred past the windows, sunlight cutting golden patterns across the dash. "You okay?" he asked after a while, his voice low. I turned toward him. "Yeah," I said. "Just full." He nodded. "Me too." The road stretched long in front of us, but the air inside the truck was thick with things left unsaid. I watched the way his hands held the wheel, steady, strong. He was still just my boy in some part of me, but in other ways, in ways I couldn't deny anymore, he was something else entirely. A man. One I trusted more than anyone I had ever known. One I felt more for than I should have. We were maybe 20 miles outside the city when the silence broke. Brandon glanced at me, then quickly back at the road. "Do you ever wonder?" he started, then paused. I waited. He shook his head, smiling faintly to himself. "Forget it." "No," I said, gently. "Tell me." He let out a slow breath. "Do you ever wonder if maybe people just find each other in the wrong role sometimes?" My breath caught. I mean, what if the person who understands you the most, who takes care of your soul, isn't who the world says they should be? I looked at him then. Really looked. And he wasn't a boy anymore. Not in the lines of his jaw, not in the weight behind his words. He had crossed something. We both had. "Every day," I whispered. The road curved then, gently, and as he slowed to take the turn, he glanced back at me again, longer this time. He looked at me like he was asking permission to do something he already knew he needed to do. I nodded. Just once. That's all it took. He pulled onto a quiet overlook, just trees and sky, and the distant glint of water through the hills. The truck idled in the hush of nature's breath, and Brandon turned in his seat to face me fully. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. But when his hand came up to cut my face, I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I leaned into it, into the warmth of his palm, into the way his thumb traced the curve of my cheek like he was learning something sacred. And then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic or confused. It was slow, gentle, barely there. But my whole body stilled with the weight of it. Because this was a kiss born of silence, of late nights and whispered pain, of hands held and hearts exposed. It wasn't just desire. It was recognition. He pulled back, just slightly, searching my eyes like he was afraid of what he might find there. But I didn't look away. I touched his face, brushing his hair back behind his ear like I used to do when he was small, except this time, my hand lingered. "You know this doesn't make sense," I said, my voice barely a breath. "I know," he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. "But it's real." That was the part that scared me most. Because it was. We didn't say anything more as he eased the truck back onto the road, but we both knew nothing could go back to the way it was. I stared out the window, watching as the trees gave way to neighborhoods, and the wilderness receded behind us like a secret we'd agreed to keep. By the time we reached the driveway, the sky had turned pale orange with the promise of evening. Brandon killed the engine. Neither of us moved to open the door. "What now?" he asked quietly. I turned to him. "Now we breathe. We keep breathing. And we figure it out as we go." He nodded, and for a moment, I saw the boy again, the one who used to cry in my arms after nightmares, who held my hand on the first day of kindergarten, who used to ask me if I'd still love him when he was old. And I did. I loved him in every version of himself. Even now. Especially now. We got out of the truck and began unpacking the trailer like we hadn't just broken the world open. But as we moved side by side through the motions of returning home, I felt it in every glance, every unspoken beat between us. Whatever this was, it had begun. And there was no going back.